There is a strength available to you right now that has nothing to do with how hard you try. Most of us were taught the opposite. Push harder, pray longer, say more words, faster, with more urgency, until God finally notices how serious you are. And somewhere in all that pushing, we quietly missed the one thing that was actually being offered the whole time. Not a reward for effort, but a strength that shows up specifically in the absence of it. If you've ever prayed until you were exhausted and still felt like nothing changed, if you've ever tried to earn a breakthrough you were already qualified for, if you've been running on empty for so long that rest feels like a foreign language, stay with me for the next 27 minutes, because I want to show you something almost nobody explains clearly. There is a kind of strength that doesn't come from doing more. It comes from finally, deliberately, doing less, and letting something bigger than your own effort carry the weight instead. Today, 4 truths, unpacked deeply. The lost art of actual stillness. What waiting on God really looks like, compared to the noisy version most of us were handed. The difference between doing and done, and why so many sincere people are exhausting themselves trying to finish something that was already finished before they started. How God actually communicates, often through pictures and quiet impressions, rather than the constant internal debate most of us call thinking. And finally, what all of this looks like on an ordinary Tuesday, how stillness holds up under real financial pressure, real fear, and how even your phone can become a tool for love instead of another source of noise. Along the way, real stories, the kind you've probably lived or watched someone close to you live, because a truth only really sticks once you've seen it move inside an actual life. Stay to the end. The last section is where this gets completely practical, where stillness stops being a nice idea and becomes something you can actually use the next time life gets loud. Let's start with the part almost everyone gets wrong first. Section 1. The lost art of stillness. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us picked up the idea that prayer is measured in words. Words, more sincerity. Louder prayer, more faith. Longer prayer, more devotion. And so when we come to God with a need, our instinct is to talk, fast, urgent, filling every silence with more requests, more explanations, more reminders to God about how serious the situation actually is. But consider a completely different picture of what waiting on God actually means. Not waiting as in standing in a line tapping your foot, annoyed at the delay. Waiting as in a posture, a settled, unhurried, attentive stillness, the way you'd wait on someone you deeply trust, giving them your full attention instead of talking over them the entire time. Here's an honest question worth sitting with. When was the last time you brought a need to God and then actually stopped talking long enough to simply be with Him, not performing a request, not managing the conversation, just present, quiet, attentive? For most of us, the honest answer is rarely, if ever, because stillness feels unproductive. It feels like nothing is happening, and in a world that measures worth by output, nothing happening feels dangerously close to wasted time. But here's what's actually happening in that stillness, even though it looks like nothing from the outside. Think about the difference between a radio constantly broadcasting on its own frequency and that same radio finally switched into receiving mode. A radio that never stops transmitting can never actually pick anything up, no matter how good the signal being sent to it is. It's too busy sending to receive. A lot of our prayer life has quietly become transmit only. Constant talking, constant requesting, constant explaining, and almost no time spent in receiving mode, where the signal was actually meant to come through. Here's a story worth holding on to. Picture someone walking through a financial storm, bills stacking up, no clear way out, the kind of pressure that makes a person want to talk to God nonstop, rehearsing the same fear out loud over and over, as if repeating it enough times might finally move the outcome. And instead, this person tries something different. They sit quiet, not solving anything out loud, just present, attentive, letting their mind settle on the goodness and beauty of who God actually is, instead of the size of the problem in front of them. Nothing about the bank account changes in that stillness, but something in the soul does. The panic that was driving every decision starts to lower, and from that lowered, settled place, clearer decisions start to emerge, not from panic, but from a mind that finally had room to actually think rather than just react. That's not passivity. That's actually one of the most disciplined things a person can do, because everything in a crisis screams at you to talk faster, move faster, fix it faster. Choosing stillness in that moment takes more restraint than most people realize. Here's the deeper layer, though, the part that makes stillness genuinely powerful, rather than just calming. When you get quiet enough, for long enough, something shifts from you constantly generating your own thoughts and solutions to you actually noticing what's being placed there instead. Call it an impression, call it a gentle picture forming in your mind, call it the quiet sense of a direction you hadn't logically arrived at through your own reasoning. That's the part that never gets a chance to happen when every available second is filled with your own words, your own noise, your own transmitting. Consider this pattern in ordinary human relationships first, since it's easier to see there. Two people who talk over each other constantly rarely feel truly close, no matter how much they've technically said to one another. But two people who know how to sit in comfortable silence together, really listening, not performing, often describe that closeness as some of the deepest connection they've ever felt. Words matter, but presence, actual attentive presence, does something words alone cannot do. If that's true between two people, why would it be any less true between you and God? So here's the practical shift. Next time you bring something to God, try this. Say what you need to say, honestly, briefly, and then stop. Sit in the quiet that follows, instead of immediately filling it with more words. Let your mind settle, not on the size of the problem, but on the goodness of the one you're sitting with. You may not get an instant answer, but you will very likely notice something you hadn't noticed while you were busy talking. A picture, a piece, a direction, a settledness that wasn't there when the noise was. Now, once you start practicing that kind of stillness, you're going to run into a quiet but very common obstacle: the deep, trained habit of believing you have to do something in order to deserve what God has already provided. That habit sabotages more peace than almost anything else, and it's exactly what we need to look at next. Section 2. Doing versus done. Here is one of the most exhausting habits a sincere person can carry without realizing it: quietly treating faith like a job application that's never quite finished being reviewed. Somewhere along the way, many of us absorbed a version of belief that sounds like this: pray enough, behave well enough, follow enough rules, and eventually you'll have proven yourself worthy of the good things God has for you. And under that belief, rest is basically impossible, because the application is never technically closed. There's always one more thing to do to keep qualifying. But consider the actual difference between two very different words: doing and done. Doing means the work is still in progress, still incomplete, still depending on your continued effort to reach the finish line. Done means the work has already been completed, fully, by someone else, and your only role now is to receive it, rather than finish it. Here's the picture worth holding on to. Imagine someone who was handed a fully paid receipt for something enormous, a debt entirely settled, an account already closed out in full, and instead of walking away in relief, they keep showing up at the counter, offering small payments toward a bill that no longer exists. Nobody's asking them for those payments. The receipt already says paid in full, but some old habit, some old fear, keeps them coming back to pay a debt that was already handled. That is exactly what it looks like when a person keeps trying to do their way into something that was already finished and handed to them as a gift. This shows up constantly in ordinary life, not just in big theological ideas. Someone who has genuinely been forgiven for something keeps punishing themselves anyway, as if their own ongoing guilt is somehow required to complete the forgiveness. Someone who has been given rest keeps working through it anyway, because stopping feels like it would be irresponsible, even though the actual requirement was already met before they ever showed up. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. Is there an area of your life right now where you are still doing, still striving, still trying to earn, still showing up at a counter with payments for something that was actually already marked done a long time ago? Now, here's an important distinction, because this truth gets misunderstood constantly. Resting in something already finished is not the same as doing nothing at all, ever, in any area of life. It's not an excuse for laziness or carelessness. It's the difference between working from acceptance versus working for acceptance. One produces a person who serves, gives, and grows out of overflow and gratitude. The other produces a person who serves, gives, and grows out of fear and exhaustion, terrified that stopping even briefly might cost them everything they've been trying to earn. Here's a story that captures this well. Picture two employees at the same company. One works long hours because they're terrified that if they ever slow down, they'll be seen as replaceable, expendable, not enough. The other works long hours too, some weeks, but from a place of genuinely wanting to contribute, fully secure in their position, taking real rest without guilt, because their value was never actually sitting on their productivity in the first place. From the outside, both might look identically busy in a given week, but one is quietly burning down and the other is building something sustainable, because the internal engine driving the exact same hours is completely different. This is precisely the difference between religion that turns faith into an endless list of rules: don't do this, must do that, keep performing to stay qualified, and genuine rest in something already accomplished on your behalf. Religion built on rules produces exhausted people constantly checking whether they've done enough. Rest built on a finished work produces people who still do plenty, but from security, not fear. So the next time guilt whispers that you haven't done enough to deserve peace, to deserve provision, to deserve the good thing you're hoping for, pause and ask honestly, is this actually still owed, or was it already marked done a long time ago, and I simply never stopped showing up at the counter to keep paying for it? Section 3. Pictures over logic. Now here's something that surprises a lot of people the first time they really consider it. God frequently doesn't speak the way we expect him to. Not through a booming internal monologue arguing point by point through pure logic. Often through something far quieter, a picture, an impression, a sudden gentle thought about doing something kind for someone specific, arriving almost out of nowhere. Most of us default entirely to logic when we're trying to figure out what to do next. Weigh the pros, weigh the cons, analyze every angle until a decision emerges from pure reasoning. And logic absolutely has its place. Nobody's suggesting you abandon wisdom or planning, but there's an entire channel of guidance that gets missed completely when logic is the only frequency you're tuned to. Here's an example worth picturing clearly. Someone is going about an ordinary day, and out of nowhere, a specific person crosses their mind, not triggered by anything logical, no recent conversation, no obvious reason. Along with the thought comes a gentle sense. Reach out to them, encourage them, check in on them. Logic might dismiss that instantly. There's no evidence anything's wrong, no data points suggesting urgency, nothing to justify the interruption. But the person who actually acts on it sends the message anyway and discovers that the timing was uncannily precise, that the person on the other end was in exactly the kind of moment where a small, unexpected word of encouragement mattered enormously. That's not a coincidence pattern that only happens to a spiritually gifted few. That's a frequency available to anyone willing to actually listen for it, rather than requiring every prompting to first survive a logical cross-examination before being taken seriously. Here's the crucial distinction worth learning to recognize, because this is exactly where people get confused and sometimes even a little afraid to trust this kind of guidance at all. Not every image or impression that pops into your mind is from the same source. Anxiety generates pictures too, vivid, detailed, frightening ones, usually about worst-case outcomes that haven't happened and probably won't. Anxious pictures tend to be specific about disaster and vague about any actual next step. They corner you. They don't build anything. They just replay the same fear on a loop. Genuine guidance, by contrast, tends to feel constructive rather than corrosive. It points toward compassion, toward helping, toward encouraging someone, toward a specific kind action, rather than a vague spiral of dread. It tends to carry a settledness with it, even when it's asking you to do something slightly outside your comfort zone. Fear-based pictures agitate. Guidance-based pictures, even when they stretch you, tend to bring a strange kind of peace alongside the stretch. Here's a simple filter worth using. Does this picture in my mind move me toward kindness, toward action that helps someone, toward something constructive, or does it just replay fear with no actual door out of it? The first is worth paying attention to and often worth acting on quickly, because these promptings tend to have precise timing that logic alone would never have caught. The second is worth naming for what it is, gently setting down and returning your attention to something steadier. This is a muscle like anything else. The first few times you notice one of these gentle promptings and act on it, it can feel uncertain, even a little silly. But over time, as you watch the pattern play out, the message that arrived at exactly the right moment, the encouragement that landed exactly when someone needed it most, you start trusting the frequency more, not because you've abandoned wisdom, but because you've added an entire channel of guidance you'd been tuning out before. Now, all of this, stillness, resting in what's already done, listening for pictures instead of only logic, none of it means much if it only works in theory. So let's bring this all the way down into an actual ordinary day, because that's where this either holds up or it doesn't. And this next part includes something almost nobody connects to faith at all: your phone. Section 4. Living this out on an ordinary day. Let's start with fear, because that's where most people actually need this the most. You picture a real, ordinary version of financial pressure. Not a dramatic movie scene, just the quiet, grinding stress of numbers that don't add up the way you need them to. The instinctive response, for almost everyone, is to talk about it constantly, with others, with yourself, internally rehearsing the fear over and over, as if enough mental repetition might somehow produce a solution. Here's a different response worth trying, drawn directly from everything we've walked through today. When the fear rises, instead of talking faster, get quiet, not ignoring the problem, genuinely dealing with it practically, wisely, where action is actually needed. But underneath the practical steps, choosing stillness as the emotional posture rather than panic. There's something physically real about this, worth naming plainly. A racing, talking, anxious mind keeps the whole body in a state of alarm, tense, reactive, poorly equipped to make good decisions. A quiet, settled mind, even one still facing the exact same problem, has access to a kind of clarity and strength that a panicked mind simply doesn't. This isn't wishful thinking. It's a completely observable difference in how people function under identical pressure, depending entirely on whether their internal posture is frantic or settled. So the practical instruction is almost absurdly simple, even though it's genuinely hard to do in the moment. When the fear comes, get still before you get loud. Let your mind settle on who God actually is, rather than immediately spiraling around how big the problem looks. From that settled place, the next right action tends to become obvious in a way it never does, from inside the panic. Now here's the part that connects all of this to something you're holding in your hand, probably right now, or within arm's reach, your phone. Most of us experience our phones as a primary source of comparison, judgment, and low-grade anxiety. Scroll, compare, judge, feel slightly worse, repeat. But that same device can become something entirely different the moment it's used deliberately as a tool for love rather than a tool for noise. Here's a picture worth trying this week. Instead of opening an app to consume, judge, or compare, open it to send one specific, genuine word of encouragement to one specific person. No audience, no public post, just a private message reminding someone that they're seen, that they matter, that someone noticed something good in them recently. This sounds small. It is small. But remember what we just covered about pictures over logic. This is exactly the kind of prompting worth acting on quickly rather than talking yourself out of. A quiet nudge to encourage someone specific, sent through the same device that usually just adds noise, can land at exactly the moment that person needed it most, and you may never even find out how much it mattered. Here's a small story worth holding on to. Someone going through a quietly difficult season, the kind nobody else around them fully knew about, received a short, unremarkable message from someone they hadn't heard from in months. Just a simple line, saying they'd been thought of, that something good had been noticed in them a while back and never mentioned. That tiny, low-effort message, sent on a whim, became something the receiving person held onto for weeks afterward, describing it later as one of the things that kept them going through that season. The sender had no idea the timing mattered that much. They just acted on the quiet nudge instead of scrolling past it. This is what all 4 of today's truths look like, stitched together on an actual Tuesday. Stillness instead of constant noise. Resting in what's already provided instead of frantically trying to earn it through fear-driven effort. Listening for gentle pictures instead of only trusting cold logic. And using even the most ordinary tool in your pocket as an instrument of love instead of another source of comparison and dread. None of this requires you to try harder. That's the whole point. It requires you to trust more, and strive less. And that shift, small as it sounds, changes the entire texture of an ordinary day. So here's everything tied together. Stillness isn't wasted time. It's the posture that finally lets you receive instead of only transmit. Done isn't the same as doing, and resting in what's already finished isn't laziness. It's the difference between working from fear and working from security. Pictures aren't a lesser form of guidance than logic. They're often a channel logic was never built to catch, and learning to tell them apart from anxious imagination is a skill worth building deliberately. And all of it comes down into an ordinary day, into stillness instead of panic when fear rises, and into using even your phone as a small, quiet instrument of love instead of another source of noise. Real strength was never about trying harder. It's about trusting more, resting more, listening more, and discovering that the very thing you were exhausting yourself trying to produce was already being carried by someone stronger than you the entire time. If even one of these 4 truths landed on something real in you today, tell me which one in the comments. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we unpack next. If this helped you see something differently, send it to the one person you know who's been exhausting themselves trying to earn something that was already given to them. And if you want more of this, honest, unhurried conversations about faith, rest, and the parts of walking with God almost nobody explains plainly, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Until next time, stop transmitting long enough to receive. The strength you've been trying to produce was never yours to manufacture. It was always meant to be given.